Australia's attempt to win a seat at the United Nations Security Council could be on shaky ground. Diplomatic sources have told the ABC that the bid's not going well, with even some close neighbours refusing to support it. Critics say the major effort to garner votes is now distorting the country's foreign policy interests and dragging the foreign minister to all corners of the globe. Those involved maintain it's worth pursuing, as Hayden Cooper reports.
From Canberra to Cairo, from Astana to Abu Dhabi and most places in between. Kevin Rudd is on a diplomatic drive to put Australia back in the inner circle for the first time in a quarter of a century. But is it all worth the effort?
He's now got himself to the point where the bid itself, actually gaining the seat, winning the vote, has become a foreign policy objective in its own right. And that can't be true.
The last time Australia was at the top table, Reagan was in the White House, Gorbachev was in the Kremlin, and Richard Woolcott was Australia's man in New York. He's the last Australian to sit as a member of the UN Security Council.
That must have been in November.
These days, from retirement, he watches and hopes that he'll soon have a successor.
You can make a difference if you're on the Security Council. I think the important thing is that the Security Council is the principal organ of the UN.
The pitch is Australia, we do what we say. And that slogan is now adorning brochures and displays around the world. But what does the world make of the effort from down under, and will it succeed? The competitors are Finland and Luxembourg. 2 seats are up for grabs. A 2/3 majority is required to win. That's 128 votes at the UN.
These are both very formidable competitors.
Veteran analyst Hugh White says it'll be a difficult contest.
Finland in particular will be very hard to beat. And of course they have a big advantage. Being in Europe, they've got very high level of confidence in the European votes. They've already had big aid programs in Africa. It's a region of their focus. A lot of votes in Africa. So I think they're going to be very hard to beat indeed.
730's been told the bid is struggling, partly because the effort began way too late. Kevin Rudd put Australia into the race in 2008, a full 6 years after the competition started lobbying. So some nations, like Indonesia, have already promised their support elsewhere and done deals to secure it. Australia has no backing from the 12 former Soviet states. It's not tracking well in Southeast Asia. And at the UN in New York, Fiji is said to be running a campaign against the candidacy, urging other nations to vote against Australia.
Wouldn't surprise me at all. And one of the things that happens when you run for these candidacies is that you, in a way, put a target on your forehead and you attract unwelcome attention. Countries like Fiji, which have their own reasons to be cross with us, are using that as a point of leverage against us.
Kevin Rudd's great mission is lobbying for support from the major world alliances, like the Caribbean Community, 15 nations, the African Union, 53 nations, and the 57 member states of the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation. Since the end of last year, the minister's travel diary reveals a heavy focus on Africa and the Middle East, including trips to Ethiopia, Tunisia, Saudi Arabia, 2 visits to Kazakhstan, 2 to Egypt, 3 to Israel, and 4 trips to the United Arab Emirates. The hectic routine is here to stay.
Because that is the job of a foreign minister. And if you look closely at the job description, I'm commissioned to engage with foreigners.
But how far from home do Australia's foreign policy interests extend?
Foreign ministers should travel, and I don't think it's ever legitimate to criticise a foreign minister for being out of the country. But I think it is true that the pattern of Rudd's travel since he became foreign minister has been unusually focused in parts of the world a long way from Australia. And I think that is a mistake. Clearly the Security Council bid has meant that Rudd, and for that matter other ministers, have spent a lot of time going to countries that frankly we wouldn't bother visiting otherwise.
Behind the scenes, Australia's also pursuing other methods of winning support, like signing bilateral tax treaties. The presence of many Caribbean nations on the list of new agreements is seen as linked to the bid. Then there's the cost. Directly, the bill is $23 million, but indirectly it's much higher. Many point to Australia's major increase in aid funding. Since the bid was announced, aid for Africa has almost trebled to just shy of $300 million a year. Funding for the Caribbean is now 20 times higher than it was 3 years ago.
The primary motive for that has been to support Australia's Security Council bid.
There are a couple of basic difficulties for Australia. One is that we don't have very much of a profile in Africa. There are 53 votes in Africa. The European Union has a very high profile in Africa. The European Union is the biggest aid donor. They obviously have colonial ties and so on with Africa. Now, we have none of those links.
As Foreign Affairs Minister Alexander Downer experienced defeat firsthand when Australia last tried and failed in 1996. Now he appears to have buried the hatchet with old enemies and joined the cause.
It's incumbent on all of us to get behind the government's campaign, and I have certainly in a number of different countries that I've visited canvassed votes for Australia. I'm glad to say I've been able to get votes on occasions.
Critics of the bid fear it's already distorting Australia's foreign policy objectives for little benefit.
In some ways it makes your international position, your international policies more subject to pressure from other countries because you want something from them, you want their vote.
Like Alexander Downer, the veteran diplomat Richard Woolcott laments the lack of bipartisan support.
This in the General Assembly when Bill Hayden was the Foreign Minister and Andrew Peacock was the Shadow Foreign Minister.
He blames today's more divisive political environment, but believes in the end it will be worth it.
I think in the modern world it's beholden on all middle-sized powers of Australia's sort of influence to try and play a constructive role in whatever situation develops.
As one diplomatic source says, every person in every posting is working on winning. The stakes are high, and the Foreign Minister has just over a year to turn a globe-trotting campaign into a New York victory.
We should win, we can win, although we started late, but it's going to take a major lobbying effort.
Kevin Rudd, yes, over the next 18 months is going to have to invest a lot of his time outside of the Asia-Pacific region, glad-handing in, everywhere from Burkina Faso to Turkmenistan to Nicaragua.